What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 216 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about another Transformers book. This is Transformers, the IDW Collection Volume 3. This collects 5 of the Spotlight issues, but it does it in a weird way. It puts 3 of the Spotlight issues at the front of the book, and then we get the New Avengers Transformers crossover miniseries, and then we get the 6-issue Devastation miniseries, and then we get 2 more Spotlight issues. I thought that was really weird. I don't know why we couldn't have put all the Spotlight issues together in this book, or if you really feel like these last 2 Spotlight issues that are collected in this book are something that you can't read until you read the Devastation miniseries, then go ahead and put those 2 issues at the beginning of the next book. I thought that was really strange. All the other books, or the other 2 that I've talked about so far, they put all the Spotlight issues together either at the beginning or at the end of the book. Speaking of the Spotlight issues, remember yesterday when I said that you really should be reading these Spotlight issues because some of the events that have been laid down in those issues are coming back into play here? Well, here is where it happens. A whole bunch of stuff that has been seeded in these Spotlight issues is coming back into play in the Devastation miniseries. I guess I'll go ahead and talk about the Devastation miniseries. So I am going to spoil everything. If you haven't been reading these Spotlight issues up until now, I'm going to spoil a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to spoil everything that doesn't even have anything to do with Transformers. All the milk that you want to drink from now to the end of time, I'm going to spoil it. Movies that you didn't want to know what happened, spoiled. Everything is spoiled. So if you'll recall, in the Nightbeat Spotlight issue, Nightbeat was going on this adventure. He's trying to solve a mystery because he's a detective. That's like his whole thing. And he is almost on the cusp of discovering the mystery of the dead universe and the people who live in the dead universe, or rather, the entities that live in the dead universe. And then his mind is wiped. We don't really know what's going on there, but the dead universe and the denizens within the dead universe, they come back in the Devastation miniseries. Also, in the 6-shot Spotlight issue that was collected in the previous volume, we get to see 6-shot return here. The Decepticons are using 6-shot against the Autobots. They basically unleash him and say, hey, look, there's the Autobots, go fight them. And then while that's happening, the Reapers, also from the 6-shot Spotlight issue, they come and they are fighting the Decepticons. So a whole bunch of stuff is going on here. It's all feels like it's kind of culminating in this miniseries. And I forgot to mention yesterday that in the events of Escalation, humankind now knows about the Transformers, which feels like a big deal here. When you watch the movies and these Transformers are having these huge, larger-than-life battles out in the middle of everywhere, it doesn't really feel like a big deal. It doesn't feel like those movies really earned that. At the end of the first movie, we get to see Sam's parents acting like they have no idea that any of this was going on. So at some point in those movies, it becomes public knowledge, but it doesn't feel like a big deal. It feels like, oh, okay, everyone knows now. Here, it feels like a huge deal. When humankind finds out in a very public battle between the Decepticons and the Autobots that there are giant robots who are hiding out on our planet, it feels huge. It feels earned, and I like that quite a bit. The Devastation miniseries, possibly my favorite of the main minis that we have had in this Transformers line so far. Really like this miniseries. I would say that you should check out this book just for the Devastation miniseries alone. I feel like it is the culmination of almost everything that's been going on, and there's more stuff that's going to be happening after this. I will say this book also has a miniseries that's a collection. It's a crossover between the New Avengers by Brian Michael Bendis, that particular team that introduced Luke Cage into the Avengers and Wolverine and Spider-Man. It's a crossover between that particular Avengers team and the Transformers, and I don't really like it. Usually I don't like crossovers like this where, okay, the Transformers, they live in their own little world, and the Avengers, they live in their own little world, but in this particular story, we're going to pretend that the Transformers and the Avengers both live on the same planet. We're not going to throw in this little portal that takes the Avengers to another universe. To me, my weird geek brain always just kind of has a fit whenever a story is written where you don't get to see the Avengers go to another world, because in this very next story, we see the Transformers are fighting to protect the planet, and where are the Avengers? We just saw that the Avengers apparently live on the same world as the Transformers, but then then they don't ever come back to help the Transformers protect the planet. Every time after this where the Avengers are fighting to save the planet, where are the Transformers? I don't like that for that reason alone. So for me, I always prefer, if you're going to have Batman and Spawn team up with each other, just do a quick one-page thing where Spawn accidentally teleports himself to Gotham City in the DC universe. You don't have to say, and then Batman walk down the street and there's Spawn living in the alleys. I don't really like that in any crossover where you're having intercompany crossovers between characters that don't normally overlap with each other like that. This particular story, like a lot of these crossovers between characters who exist in separate companies, it doesn't feel like they were particularly concerned with the story that they were going to tell. It basically feels like, okay, we want to have Optimus Prime say something like Avengers Assemble. We want to have Captain America say Autobots roll out. We want to check off all of these fanboy moments that we want to add to this story. And that's what it feels like they were more concerned with doing. It didn't feel like they were that interested in telling a good, interesting story. And Kurt Busiek once, someone complained that the JLA Avengers crossover was basically just fanboy moments, and it didn't have much of a story. And he countered that that was what it was supposed to be, that it was setting out to be basically fanboy porn. And he said, you don't accuse normal porn of being titillating and act like, well, I don't like that particular piece of porn because it's titillating. He said, well, that's what it's supposed to be. And he said, with these crossover stories like that, that's what they're supposed to be. I would argue you can have the fanboy moments, but you can also have an interesting, good story. And I just don't think that this story is very good. In this particular story, we have the Autobots and the Avengers. At one point, they almost start fighting each other because they are both trying to get into Latveria, where the Decepticons are there, and they're doing stuff. And Latveria, of course, is Dr. Doom's home country. Why would you use a Fantastic Four villain in an Avengers Transformers crossover? There are robots that the Avengers fight. For example, Ultron, he's a pretty big one. You would have to completely retool the story from the ground up. But if you are going to have the Avengers fight the Transformers and then join forces with them, why don't you use an actual Avengers villain? Have Ultron team up with Megatron. Or if you really, really have to use Dr. Doom, then have the Fantastic Four team up with the Transformers. You don't have to have Dr. Doom in an Avengers story. That bugged the crap out of me here also. So overall, this story is pretty skippable, and I hate it when people say, oh, you can skip that story because it doesn't have any bearing on the overall mythos. I usually hate it when people say that, but in this case, I didn't actually enjoy the story either. I would say there are times where just because something doesn't have a bearing on the larger whole, that doesn't mean that you should skip it. For example, there was an episode of Angel where Cordelia, she was pregnant with demon babies, and it doesn't have any of the hallmarks of a normal Angel episode that's really important in the grand scheme of things. It didn't have Wolfram and Hart, it didn't have any mention of the powers that be, it didn't have the Shanshu prophecy, it didn't have any of that stuff that is really important in the entire series of Angel, but it was still an enjoyable episode. And I think that I am comfortable saying that this new Avengers Transformers crossover is skippable because I didn't enjoy it. Now, maybe if you really have a hankering to see Spider-Man get kidnapped by the Decepticons and you want to see Captain America butt heads with Optimus Prime, if those are things that you have longed to see for most of your life, then you're going to love the story. Those are not things that I've ever cared to see. I feel like this is just a roadblock to getting to the much more interesting story of this book. For me, the previous two volumes of the IDW collections, they have been building to devastation, and then you have this story that doesn't have anything to do with any of the stories that have been building up to it. In fact, it's a little weird because at the end of Volume 2, the existence of the Transformers is now made public, and then in this Avengers Transformers crossover, the Avengers are acting like, hey, this is weird, there's talking cars. They're acting like these guys are still a secret. So that was a little weird. Overall, I would say this story is still, this book is still really good. It's got some really good spotlight issues. The RC issue I love, which this reveals that RC was experimented on by this mad scientist named Jihaxis, and that is why she is the only female Autobot. Later, that is retcon. Later, just like a couple years ago, they did a Transformers mini or a series that was entirely female Autobots, I think, and I don't know how they reconciled that with this story where we find out that RC is the only one who is explicitly female, while none of the others actually have any gender going one way or the other. So I like that issue quite a bit, but I am curious how they are going to reconcile that with this later on, with the stuff that I don't actually own. But overall, love the Spotlight issues, really love Devastation. The Avengers Transformers crossover, didn't like that very much, but I still highly, highly enjoyed this book, and I think you guys would as well if you are Transformers fans, or even if you're like me and you're just kind of dipping your toes in Transformers stories. So those are my thoughts on this book. I hope that you guys liked this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.